We are all inspired by each other and other artists, other creators. That's what makes you good at your job, is when you study that. And, it doesn't have to be about clothing. It could be about architecture or fine arts. That's what allows you to harness your creativity and use it to make something that has your voice on it.
Costume design plays an important role in filmmaking. Films like Austin Powers, Lala Land, Boogie Nights, Black Panther, and Malcolm X transport us to a different time and place through costume. But have you ever wondered how the concepts for costume designs come together? Well, we have. That's why we're talking today with Mimi Haddon, author of Palace Costume, a book about the most important costume house in Hollywood, and costume designer Shirley Kurata, who was nominated for an Oscar for her work on the wonderful film Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
We speak with Mimi and Shirley about the origin story of Palace Costume, how it's organized, and how costume designers use its vast collection. We also talk about how working with a limited budget inspires creativity, how costume designers think about color in their work, and how they collaborate with directors and other colleagues to execute on the vision for the film. This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolery.
And I'm Aaron Walter. You can get ad-free episodes, bonus content, discounted workshops, and access to our monthly AMAs with big names in design and tech by becoming a Design Better Premium subscriber. It's also the best way to support the show. Visit designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. Eli and I are super pumped to be joining our friends at User Testing at the Human Insight Summit in Austin, Texas this October, the 28th through the 30th. It's an event that will help you learn how to bring customer insights closer to the product design process. And I got to tell you, the speaker lineup is inspiring. And Eli and I will be recording a live episode of Design Better on stage with User Testing CEO Andy McMillan. 500 builders and creators will be there from some of the largest and most innovative brands in the world for a 3-day event focused on transforming the way products and experiences are built. You're going to make so many great connections there while honing your skills. And it's Austin, one of our favorite cities in the world. So right now, snag your ticket at usertesting.com/designbetter and use the code DesignBetter50 and you'll get half off your ticket. That's 50% off of your admission. Eli and I would love to meet you in person in Austin. Come see us and come meet us at the Human Insight Summit in Austin, Texas. We can't wait to see you there. Visit usertesting.com/designbetter and use code DesignBetter50 for half off your ticket. Last week, I woke up to a rather scary email from one of my banks telling me that my personal information had been compromised by a big data breach. I'm still in the process of dealing with this. Turns out that every year, both the number and scope of data breaches worldwide are rising. According to the 2022 annual data breach report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, the number of victims has gone up nearly 41.5% from 2021. There are hundreds of commercial databases and people search sites that hold your personal info, and the number grows every year. Data brokers aggregate your personal information, including your name, your social security number, your login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and a whole lot more. All of this is available for purchase by businesses and could fall into the hands of criminals. So how am I dealing with this? Well, I set up an Incogni account. Incogni reaches out on your behalf, requesting your personal data removal and deals with any objections that come up. Just within 5 minutes of me setting up my account with Incogni, they had issued 84 data removal requests. They got my info deleted from 35 sites and suppressed future data collection on me from 18 sites. Plus, they cleaned my phone number from a bunch of spam callers, and I'm very excited about that. And I'm just impressed with what I'm seeing already from Incogni. It's a great, great service. You should probably do this too. Use promo code DesignBetter at incogni.com/designbetter to get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/designbetter. Use the code DesignBetter to get 60% off an annual plan and get your personal info off of the web. And now, back to the show.
Mimi Haddon and Shirley Kurata, welcome to the Design Better podcast.
Thank you.
Hello.
We're excited to have you both here. Mimi, you just released this really cool book, Palace Costume. I have a copy here in my hand, as does Aaron. It's got all these amazing photographs of costumes from over the decades. And as a starting point, maybe we could just talk about the origin story of Palace Costume, Mimi, and then Shirley, you could talk about how you discovered it, and we could start to talk about how you use it in your work.
Yes, Melody Barnett is the person who owns Palace Costume, and it's basically her collection that she has amassed over the past 50 plus years. And what started off as Melody going to the swap meet in Orange County and selling out of her VW bus with her children and stepchildren, it just became from the bus to 30,000 square feet of space in West Hollywood with inventory well over 500,000 pieces, not including jewelry and some other items. Her husband at the time was a hair stylist for celebrities, and they lived in Laguna Beach. Her real favorites at that time were like Edwardian, Victorian clothes, and she would buy those and starch them, wash and starch, and kind of upcycle those. And she had them hanging in her living room where her husband's clients were. And this was in the late 60s. And I think a couple of them said, you should sell up on Melrose. There's this whole movement of cool thrifted items. And it was part of the 60s culture. And so she did. She first started selling through something called Liquid Butterfly. Melody is a worker. She just kind of works morning, noon, and night. So she worked really hard and created gorgeous items for them. And it wasn't too long before they just took off with her inventory and without paying her. And she kind of just laid low for a while. And then she eventually teamed up with her next door neighbor, and they opened a shop called Crystal Palace on Melrose. That was in the late 60s. And I have heard that one of the first films that they were associated with was for Bonnie and Clyde through Theodora Van Runkle, who came in and purchased some items from her and her partner, Bob Becker. And the way they described this space was, it was an old chandelier place, 50 or plus chandeliers as you walked into the opening room. And there's this crazy organ that was on one of the walls. And it sounded extremely eccentric and a character in and of itself. And eventually Melody, she moved to other spaces because the Pacific Design Center was built on that spot in West Hollywood. She slowly parted ways with her partner, Bob Becker. And right around the time of Chinatown, Anthea Silbert reached out to Melody, a famous costume designer, and suggested that Melody switch from retail to keeping her inventory so that future costume designers could use the inventory in film for authenticity. So that's kind of the origin story. One building on Fairfax Avenue turned into 3 buildings on Fairfax Avenue, turned into, once the outside area was filled in, turned into 4 buildings on Fairfax Avenue. So that's kind of a short explanation of the expansion over 50 years.
Shirley, I'd love to understand from your eyes and your vantage point as a costume designer working on films, what was it like to go into Palace Costume for the first time and discover everything that was there?
I mean, it was such a dream because to have all these treasures and these amazing pieces all in one space, it was a little overwhelming at first because also to navigate through the palace, there's many little rooms and there's other floors. And so you totally could easily get lost in there. But it was such a amazing way to sort of appreciate vintage fashion and be inspired by all those pieces that she had.
Mimi, I'm curious. Aaron and I were talking about it before the interview, and we are joking, is there maybe like a Dewey Decimal System, or how do they organize these, thousands and thousands of costumes in a way that you can actually find them?
500,000 pieces. There's got to be some type of system.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually divided by like decades. So we have like a 20s room, 30s, 40s, 50s. It's primarily by that, but then it's like there's also subdivisions of like the denim room, the sort of like Hawaiian themed room. There's a more like costumey, like dance theatrical room, which is like one of my favorites. They sort of categorize it by, these sort of decades or themes. And for the most part, it's sort of barcoded, except for like the jewelry and accessories. But that's the primary way of most costume houses is they have a barcode system.
It's a little bit of a relic of a barcode system.
Yes.
I think it dates back to the 90s. And she was one of the first rental houses, I think, to develop a barcode system in the first place. But I think they've had the same person who has been operating that. So it's kind of like just playing catch up. And I think to start off from scratch at this point would be such an undertaking that they're just kind of like, answering any updates as they go.
Mimi, I wonder, one theme that we see with lots of creative people who work in various disciplines is they just kind of see the world in a slightly different way. And it sounds like Melody is that type of person to recognize fashion and to see pieces, to recognize that like this is a special thing that is cast off, but I'm going to reclaim it, I'm going to upcycle it, I'm going to preserve it, and I'm going to catalog all of this stuff together to preserve that history and the creative vision. Could you talk to us a little bit about like how Melody's mind works and how she sees things?
Yeah, I can tell you there's kind of like a layered aspect to that. To start, her mother was an amazing seamstress and a very creative person. And she describes going kind of window shopping. Melody and her sister would go window shopping, and whatever they liked, the mom would go home and like create that for her daughters. And then Melody took sewing and fashion design in high school. She was voted most likely to become a fashion designer at that time. But to be quite honest, I mean, she has many different lives. And one of her main passions is actually interior architecture and interior design. So I always think it's one thing to have this passion. To this day, she goes to the Melrose Trading Post, I think every week, which is like a really fantastic flea market. And she will find the most outrageous, eccentric, interesting items around. I walked in there and there was like these 5-inch platform creepers that were covered with vintage men's ties. And that's just something that she acquired not too long ago. But part of her, I would say, expertise is actually figuring out how to house this collection. That is the next level. And I know Shirley would agree. Like, I mean, as a vintage lover, you just want to consume, and everything you touch, you're just like, must have, but it's just not a reality. I think Melody has figured out a way just through perseverance, hard work, and she has a vision just on how to house and to organize all of these items to make them available to designers like Shirley.
So what's the process like for you, Shirley, as a costume designer, if you wanted to use some pieces, include some in a project you're working on, or take inspiration from them? What does that look like?
I usually create sort of like mood boards for each character. And, some projects that I work on aren't period films, but I think that there's so many pieces there that can serve as inspiration, or even just like using it and mixing it up so that it creates this character. For me, I just like to sometimes just go through the aisles and look at pieces that are inspiring, that can work for the character. So for example, Everything Everywhere All at Once wasn't a period film. There were a few flashbacks. I think there was like a 70s and 80s flashback, but in terms of like some of the sort of more sci-fi scenes, I wanted to see what was there that could be cool or to use as part of their costume. And I found this sort of vest that was made out of like computer boards. And it was so cool. And I was like, oh my God, I have to use this. And so I put that on Key. He was in the RV. And so that was like one piece that sort of was like, okay, this is great inspiration. And I went ahead and bought computer parts and wires and use portions of that for some of the other characters that were in that scene with him. A lot of times you don't know what, is exactly going to inspire you, but then you find things and it's sort of a launching pad for completing the look and being inspired by it.
Could we dig into that a little bit more, and when you know that there's probably something that I could discover to find the right look here, or this is something that I want to fabricate like from scratch to really create something that people have never seen before? How does your thought process work there?
It ranges from just, the fabric choice, finding the right fabric and colors that you feel like would be great for the costume. It could also be the cut of something. You kind of sometimes go in a little bit blind, For me, I just like walk around and find pieces that I'm like, I think this is cool, maybe I could use this somewhere. Other times, it might be more specific, like finding a piece that would be good for a Chinese opera scene or like a sort of fictitious sci-fi scene. It's all different with each project, but you definitely need to have a sort of kind of like vision board for each character. And so that research is really important in finding how you're going to create a costume.
Mimi, in the course of putting together your book, you talked to a number of different costume designers. And I wonder, is there any surprising way they used Palace costume earlier in their process or later in their process, or anything that you discovered talking to them that was a key story from that kind of part of the process?
Well, I think the common thread is just what Shirley's talking about, in that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for and you just like walk in with an open mind. And I think that is the beauty of Palace, is that the fact that you're able to touch these items is vastly different than doing research on the computer or even in the magazine. The way Shirley's talking about selecting fabrics and textures and different things, a texture from the 1800s, a lace or a pleat or some sort of structure might inspire something very futuristic. That was the common thread, I would say, among all of the designers that I spoke with.
I wonder if we could dig in a little bit more, Shirley, into the vision boards you were talking about, because I'm really curious about that process, the back and forth with directors. What's the conversation? Like, how much of the vision for the look of costumes is your vision versus input from directors, and what that back and forth is like? And then what are the other artifacts besides these boards that you're creating?
Filmmaking is all about collaboration. So it's collaboration with the actors, it's collaboration with the director, with the production designer, hair, makeup team. And so it's always good to have sort of like a visual board to share with all of them. For example, if I give my boards to the production designer, they can give input as to like, well, these colors will work great with the set, or these colors, they might not pop enough. And same with the director, like I might have an idea for a character and the director might have a totally different idea. It's important to sort of have that conversation. And from there, like the boards evolve, they change, things get added, things get removed. It's never static. There's always a point of evolution from start to finish.
And are they physical, like on set? This is a place where we go look at this together, or is it like a digital thing that you send out?
Now it's a digital thing, but I went to the Academy Library and they showed me their actual physical boards. Like, back in the day, we didn't have computers. Like I saw the mood boards for Pretty in Pink. And that was so exciting for me because it was just like cutouts from magazines. I thought that was so cool. And, back in the day, it was that, or it was like tear sheets, and people would make little books. But now, we do things all digitally because it's just easier to sort of pass back and forth.
When you're on set and you're collaborating, do you ever kind of sketch things out or pass sketches back and forth? Or is there any kind of hand-drawn elements to what you're working on?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, I think, I wish I had more time to like fully sketch things out. We also hire artists to do sketches for us. I can draw. I'm not the best at it. I'd rather hire someone that does a better job than me just because they'll do it faster. But, sometimes I'll just sketch something out sort of roughly and then pass it on to an artist to sort of do it properly.
I was reading another interview with you, Shirley, and it mentioned that one of the biggest challenges on working with Everything Everywhere was it was a very limited prep time and kind of a limited budget. And I'm curious, like Aaron and I were talking again before the interview about how that can sometimes inspire real creativity, like thinking back to the early Star Wars, and they definitely had limited budget, and it actually played into it. They were able to make things look sort of more lived in, more used, and in that way more realistic. So I'm just curious, how does those sort of limitations and constraints play into your creativity?
I mean, I kind of like having those limitations because it sort of narrows the focus. If it was just like you can do anything and money was no object, and I think that's almost like a little bit stressful, a little bit daunting. I kind of like it when your scope is a little more narrowed because from there you're able to be like, okay, what can I do with what I'm given? It kind of allows me to be a little bit more focused in a way. I think it's really more fun and challenging that way too, of like trying to find a way where, you could use existing pieces, mixing some pieces from Palace with finding some sort of like things that can add to it, or creating costumes that work with existing costumes and sort of combining it. There's lots of ways of doing things where it looks way more expensive than it is. And I think that's part of the challenge of being a costume designer, is trying to find these solutions for that.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. Design Better is supported by our pals at LinkedIn, our favorite social network. If you do any B2B marketing, you know just how noisy the ad space can be. If your message isn't targeted to the right audience, it just disappears into the noise. But with LinkedIn ads, you can precisely reach the professionals who are more likely to find your ad relevant. And LinkedIn's targeting capabilities can help you reach people by job title, industry, company, and more. They can do all this because LinkedIn has 1 billion members with great profiles. Through LinkedIn ads, you can start building relationships with 1 billion professionals, 180 million senior level executives, and 10 million C-level executives. Start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. They'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. To claim that, just go to linkedin.com/designbetter. That's linkedin.com/designbetter. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn. It's the place to be, to be. Eli and I are big fans of learning from other creative disciplines. That's why we want to recommend another podcast for you. It's called On Set With. It's a podcast from HGTV and Max, and it takes you behind the scenes of some of the most iconic sets from the shows that changed TV history. We love how this show takes you into the creative minds who designed the sets for Friends, True Detective Season 1, I loved it, The Gilded Age, Game of Thrones, The Sopranos, White Lotus, Girls, Succession, and more. Doesn't that sound fascinating? You get to hear from the production designers, set decorators, and visual collaborators who brought these famous locations to life. It was fascinating to hear that on True Detective Season 1, the designers spent almost a year hoarding and sourcing set decor, which set the tone for that series. And from the Gilded Age set designers on how their intense research of late 1800s interiors led writers of the show to create a whole new character for the series. You can listen to On Set With on Max or wherever you get podcasts. It's time for a coffee break with our friends over at Methodical Coffee, methodicalcoffee.com. And we have with us our friend Will Schertz, co-founder and master roaster. Will, so if we want to have a really great cup of coffee in the middle of a busy day, what sort of gear should we be thinking that we should have on hand? And maybe, operating it in a couple different budgets. One like super cheap budget up to kind of medium and maybe higher end budget. What kind of gear would you recommend?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost, if you are buying whole bean coffee, I think it's so important that you have a good quality coffee grinder. If you have a good quality coffee grinder, you can pretty much brew coffee in a cereal bowl and get a good result. And this is because if you're grinding coffee, you have to make sure that the grind consistency is even. The whole amount of ground coffee has to be even ground coffee particles. And so I love Baratza's line of coffee grinders. if you go to their website, you can find a whole spectrum of grinders from $120 to however much you want to spend. And a conical burr coffee grinder is really important. So once you have that, I think if you want to get into manually brewing coffee, a Kalita Waves coffee brewer is very user-friendly. You can buy a stainless steel one that is impossible to break. That's what I use in my kitchen. Or if you want a more automated brewer, I really love Bonavita's coffee brewers. And I also really love Fellow Products, all of their gear. Pretty much can't go wrong. And the funny thing is, I think with coffee gear, there is something true about getting what you pay for, especially with coffee grinders. From my experience, the more expensive coffee grinders, however much your budget will allow, you generally do seem to get a better return on your investment.
And we want to make sure that we have burr grinders, not those blade grinders that are used to grind up spices.
Yes, you see spice grinders used a lot. And while in a pinch, it's better ground brewing than whole bean brewing, I do think that those spice grinders, they operate in a way that gives you both very coarsely ground and way too finely ground coffee all at the same time. And that is the importance of a burr coffee grinders, to get that even ground consistency.
That's fantastic. Will, where can people learn more about Methodical Coffee?
If you go to methodicalcoffee.com, you will actually go and look at our blog. We have blog posts talking about all things brewing coffee, buying coffee, coffee equipment, using that equipment. And we also have a channel on YouTube.
Learn more about Methodical Coffee and get some tips on how to brew the best cup of coffee at methodicalcoffee.com. Web designers, this one's for you. I've got 1 minute to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things that you can do from start to finish in 1 minute or less on Studio. You can adapt your designs for every device using responsive AI, reuse assets like templates, widgets, sections, and design libraries across sites and share them with your team. Switch up the styling of hundreds of web pages. That means fonts, layouts, colors, all in a click. Add no-code animations and gradient backgrounds right in the editor. Export your designs from Figma to Wix Studio in just a click. Oh, and one more big one. Package and deliver everything your client needs in one smooth handover. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. And now, back to the show. Mimi, when you were working on this book, did you come across any stories of an amazing find that influenced a character in a film in particular? Someone who at Palace found like, okay, this is the thing. And this kind of influences the way that that actor might think about the role or how they're portrayed in the film?
Well, let's see. I know Mary Zofries talks about finding like the perfect dress for Mia in La La Land. I think a lot of times when people do pull things from Palace, they might use it as inspiration, perhaps redesign something that's inspired by that original vintage piece. So in that case, Mary Zofries was able to put it directly on Emma Stone, which even though it's a contemporary space, that La La Land timeframe, Mia's a young woman in Los Angeles, and she probably is a vintage shopper. So that kind of throws in like a little description of Mia's character for that film. Another example, which actually is in the book, is Ariane Phillips looking for the perfect Hawaiian shirt for Brad Pitt's character. And she just found like the perfect colorway, the perfect vibe. She had someone redesign it slightly, and she describes that in the book. But I think it's still like having that original piece, which is found like there's an entire small room on the bottom floor at Palace that just has Hawaiian, like vintage Hawaiian shirts. So even though it was slightly altered, it still served like as the perfect piece for the jumping off point. And then she had a dozen shirts made for various scenes.
Also, like, things aren't made anymore like they used to be. The quality, the sort of detailing, you don't always find anymore today. So I think that's why it's so helpful to have access to these vintage pieces and study the technique and how it was made. Also, fabrics probably don't even exist anymore. And having access to that is like super important. I just feel like the quality of things has sort of decreased so much today that, we really need to sort of like go back in time to sort of like study and appreciate true craftsmanship and construction.
Are there designers who are making really high quality pieces that you in particular, like for yourself, that you enjoy and respect because of the way things are constructed?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Rei Kawakubo and Comme des Garçons. Of course, like a lot of these things, though, they're so expensive. If you really want true craftsmanship, we barely can ever afford it. So I think they're not as accessible as would be a vintage piece.
Shirley, we're curious about how you think about color when you're designing costumes, and folks can't see you right now unless we post a video clip, but your background, your outfit seem to be very, very considered, and the colors like really work well together, that which may be subconscious, but yeah, just curious how that plays into the work that you do.
Color is so important in what I do. I use it to define the character or the mood that they're in. I think it also helps delineate different scenes. If you want to also show a sort of timeline shift or a scene shift, I think it's important to sort of like find colors that work well with the sets that they're in. So it's like one of the most important things that I consider when I'm costume designing.
We had on OK Go a while back, and one of their lead singers worked on a movie, and they very consciously did it in different time periods and kind of had a color theme throughout each one, which was kind of fun. They took it to an extreme, as they often do in their work, which is cool.
Yeah.
I've probably watched those videos a million times with my kids when they were growing up. I loved it.
Yeah, they're amazing.
I'm curious if you've ever had an actor push back on a costume design. Like if someone has ever said, like, I don't know, this just doesn't feel like my character, something that my character would wear.
That happens quite often. Sometimes you try things on and they're like, I'm just not feeling this, or I'm not comfortable in this. Other times it might be like, I don't think I could do this stunt, if they're doing stunts in it. That's part of the process. And, I accept that and I understand it. So usually you have to come into a fitting, with a wide variety of options and sort of narrow down from there. But I get it. There are just some things that you put on and you don't feel it. So I don't take offense to that whatsoever. Usually, we'll get a rack, we'll go in the costume house, and we'll just start pulling pieces that we feel, are good for the characters. And, there might be also pieces where it's like, oh, well, I don't know what we can use this for, but it's cool. So I'm going to put it on the rack. And from there, we just sort of like decide on which ones are the right ones. And we sort of edit down usually to our sort of like favorite pieces and get those written up. I go to other costume houses and do some shopping as well. And if we have to build something, we get that made. And so we have all of those pieces at the fitting. And sometimes it's like, like 4 or 5 racks, if not more, of clothing. And from there, we sort of pick our favorites and what sort of aligns the most with the actor and the director and what I think is the best look for that scene. It's a long process, it's sometimes months and months of research and pulling and observing. And it's definitely sort of a long, involved process, but it's also something that's very part of what a costume designer does.
And walking through Palace, it is a huge space. There are some locations at Palace where there tend to be more, of the pulled racks of clothing. And I always get a thrill, like you'll see the rack from afar and you kind of get a sense of what's happening there. And then you see the designer, you see the production, and then you'll like maybe see some specific characters on various items. You just like get a sense right away of what the costume designer is trying to say.
Yeah, I do the same thing too. I'll look at other racks. I'm like, oh, this show looks fun. Or, I love the color palette of this rack. It's always fun to see what other designers are doing.
And Melody and Lee is Melody's right-hand person who's been there almost since the beginning. They really take note of what the designers are pulling. They'll say, oh yeah, that designer has really good pulls, or, they love their work in film and or television, and they really do notice.
I would assume that there's like a virtuous cycle that happens here, that designers come in, they do their pulls. Surely, based on what you've said, a lot of times that's sort of an inspiration, and then something might be constructed or modified. And then presumably there's another piece that could go back into the collection, that it would just continue to expand. Is there that cycle of fashion always coming in from the set?
Oh, definitely. And I also know that fashion designers come in for inspiration to Palace. And so, yes, there's definitely that cycle of drawing something, creating something from something that you're inspired from there, and then it kind of coming back into their collection. Or it's also like, you see there's like the 70s was inspired by the 30s. So you see a 30s inspired piece, which then somebody from today might take that piece and then create something that's from today, but it's all sort of like connected. I think it's also in line with how fashion is, because it sort of cycles around in that way.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. I'm curious how each of you sees costume design influencing streetwear and fashion designers in general. So it wouldn't even have crossed my mind that fashion designers would be going in there for inspiration. That makes sense. Can you give us some specific examples of, like, is there a relationship between costume design and fashion design?
Most definitely, I think like certain films inspired the fashion of the time. When you think about like Flashdance, right? And the cutoff sweatshirt, or like the movie Clueless, and her style is definitely has inspired the way fashion is. I think it sort of like works both ways, and I think what's out there in fashion has inspired costume designers to dress their characters. That inspiration is what makes this job so interesting. We are all inspired by each other and other artists, other creators. And that's what makes you good at your job, is when you do study that. And, it doesn't have to be about clothing. It could be about architecture or fine arts. All these things are things that you sort of like take in like a sponge. And then from there, I think that's what allows you to harness your creativity and use it to make something that has your voice on it, but definitely has the inspiration from other people and artists around you.
Shirley, I'm curious how your work has changed, and maybe you could probably build on this too with other designers you spoke to. As over the decades, as digital technology has become more of a part of the filmmaking process, and green screens and things like that. And at the same time, I went and saw just recently the most recent Alien film, and from behind the scenes stuff that I read, they used a lot of animatronics and non-digital things. So maybe that's kind of working its way back into film. But yeah, just overall curious how that affects your work, if it does at all.
I mean, I think there definitely is a broad use of the digital world, I guess, for references and stuff like that. But I still think that there is a need for the sort of like physical, tangible, like you need to feel the clothes. Sometimes I'm doing shopping online, because you can't find it locally or whatever. And, you'll order something and then you get it and you're like, oh, this just feels terrible, or this is not at all what I was expecting. And so I think we still, as humans, need to be able to touch and feel. And, we might not always be able to do that because, the object or whatever the article of clothing is, in another country or something. But, while we're able to, I think it's like, it really is important to sort of have it in your hand, study it up close. There are details that you can't really quite capture digitally. And so I don't think that that's ever going to go away. I think that we will always need access to galleries to see art, or like costume houses. And I hope that they do continue to live on. I know that there are a lot of costume shops that are closing, like the little mom and pop ones. And I think that's really unfortunate, when you think about like Amazon and all this stuff where people are just ordering things. But the ability to sort of like also discover things in person and not rely on just a photo that's online. There's also just things that you might not be able to discover digitally. Those pieces could be something that just creates entire character, in a film. I love going to flea markets like Melody does, and just find pieces that I've never seen before or never imagined.
And also, there is an element where the vintage pieces, specifically the ones, dating, 100 years or 75 years, a lot of them are deteriorating. And that is a discussion that many of the designers brought up, is that it is fantastic to have this as a resource. The reality is that these pieces are not being kept in museum quality, perfect archival conditions with temperature control, light control, etc. So there is that compromise of, it is kind of a gift to be able to handle these items, knowing that by placing them on a person, perhaps, just like through oils and sweat and etc., it does kind of compromise the lifespan a little bit, or a lot. But I feel like Melody is very philosophical in that regard. She realizes that the pieces are irreplaceable oftentimes, but she still, regardless, wants to have this as a service to offer to costume designers.
So costume design certainly influences the way an actor feels on set, which in turn shapes the performance. And I can't help but just think that fashion does the same for all of us. As a young kid growing up in the Midwest, where I didn't often have access to culture and fashion was a way I sort of constructed an identity for myself. I wonder if each of you could talk about your relationship to fashion through the years and how it's helped shape the way you see yourself and in turn the way that you want to be seen by others.
I think that was brought up in our interview, Shirley, when I think you were talking about seeing the Godard films and things like that, and Room with a View. And,
Yeah.
and I was asking you if you were dressing yourself as a character in a way.
Yeah, I grew up wearing a school uniform from kindergarten through my senior year in high school. While I was kind of grateful that I didn't have to think about what to put on in the morning, it also made me want to sort of self-express with my outfits whenever given the opportunity. So of course we had free dress day. And when we had those days, it was kind of more important to sort of think of a fun, good outfit to wear that day. I think it was more special because we weren't, allowed to wear that every day. And I think that kind of started my obsession with fashion. I also had Barbie dolls too. And so I loved all the outfits that she had and stuff like that. So a combination of that sort of propelled my fascination with fashion and obviously film as well. So I'll watch a film and, watching Pretty in Pink and Molly Ringwell's outfits, it's oh, that's so cool. I want to dress like that and sort of mix vintage and all that stuff. Or Room with a View was a little bit more of a sort of Victorian turn of the century vibe. And I couldn't really find anything like that. So it was just sort of well, I'm going to wear a long skirt, with a sort of fitted jacket. And, I did my interpretation of it. Because of my interest in fashion, I went to study fashion in Paris for 3 years. That sort of opened the world to me with couture and Parisian fashion designers and all that. And I kind of came back to LA because, that's where I was born and grew up, and decided, well, we have Hollywood here. Why don't I sort of try to get into TV and film, and got into assisting, being a set costumer for many years. And then I eventually sort of ended up getting more into styling and working on music videos, styling musicians and commercials, and then have kind of gone back into TV and film, but as a costume designer. All of those elements, though, have played into how I work as a costume designer, and just sort of being around all these creatives as well. Photographers, directors, musicians, artists have all sort of really inspired me. I also work a lot with Kate and Laura Malavia for Darte. They have an amazing fashion line, and they've inspired me so much with the designs that they've created. I feel very fortunate to be around some very talented and creative people.
Well, speaking of inspiration, this question's for both of you. And Aaron and I want to know what's inspiring you right now. And that could be movies, books, and it doesn't have to be related to your work necessarily, though it can. Podcasts, what's creating inspiration for you? And maybe we could start with you, Mimi.
It's going to sound cliche, but I am very much inspired by plants and trees. And there's a fantastic workshop that I wish I could take. I don't know, I just saw on social media happening in Berlin about becoming plant. I think that's the title of the workshop. I'm an artist myself, and I love to create specifically kind of more fiber sculpture type things. And I'm just like seeing so many moments of people like really celebrating the sentience of plants and nature around us. I spent a week in the redwoods with my daughter recently and with zero cell phone reception, and woke up to the ravens flying overhead, and it was very satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the same, like nature. I feel like with COVID and the lockdown, it's kind of allowed me to be a little bit more appreciative of just going out in nature and being outside as opposed to just being inside. And I feel like, with the digital world and everything, we've become a little bit too insular. And so when given the opportunity of being able to go out and experience nature, it's become kind of such a treat that it's definitely a source of inspiration. And I feel like it's a source that feels sort of really real and connected to everything. So yeah, that definitely is also a source of inspiration for me. I mean, I think also just being out in the world and seeing people, signage, just sort of like the random things that you encounter just from driving or walking down the street, that always has been a source of inspiration to me.
It's great. Well, Mimi and Shirley, thank you so much for joining us on the Design Better podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's been great.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.